Hi there, welcome to Upside Down for the month of March. In the news lately, there's been quite a bit of talk and actually laws being passed about education and what children are being taught and parental involvement in that. And particularly, there's been something that's come up, CRT, critical race theory, that for some people are concerned that it makes people who learn about their history feel bad, and it's making our kids feel bad about themselves. And so there are laws being passed to say we can't teach anything that makes our young people feel bad about themselves. And so I wanted to talk about this. And frankly, what I really wanted to do was to hope to talk to somebody who was a recent graduate of college to talk about what their experience was. But this is such a loaded topic these days that I realized that talking with someone about this who's looking for a job might, if it was put on the web, be something that could help to prevent them from getting a job because it is such a hot topic these days. So I decided that I'd talk to somebody on the other side. This is Upside Down, so we look at things from another perspective. And I thought what we would do is talk with a teacher. Talk with a teacher who does have a job and presumably some tenure that's allowed to let you speak of it. And this is also someone who has felt the call to become more active within their profession and is currently very active within the school district. So I'd like to ask you, Kristen, for those who don't know you, to introduce yourself, where you teach, what you teach, and what you're doing these days with the union and with the school.
So I teach in Compton Unified School District in Compton, California. I currently teach at the Chavez Continuation School. So I mostly have 11th and 12th graders that need to make up credits for many reasons. And I teach at the Compton High campus. So our continuation school is set up that each comprehensive school has its own sort of satellite campus. So I'm at the Compton High campus, but we're currently displaced because Compton High is a pile of dirt because they're rebuilding it. So I joke that I'm Chavez Continuation High School, Compton satellite at Walton Middle School, because we're currently at Walton Middle School. So yeah, so it's pretty interesting. But I've been teaching in Compton for 15 years now, 2008. So yeah, 14 years now. And I love it. I taught middle school for 8 years, and now I've been at continuation for 6. The community is amazing. They are welcoming and loving, and the parents I meet are wonderful. The kids I meet, though we don't always get along, they're kids, you know. So, but they're great.
What is the ethnic and racial diversity of makeup of the people that you work with?
That I work with, or
Well,
my students? Okay, my students. So my students are predominantly Latino or Latinx. So they about 78%. And then the second biggest chunk is African American Black, right? And then we have Polynesian, and then a sprinkling of white. And I have not had an Asian student, but I'm not sure if we have any in the district. So yeah, so predominantly, I've only had one identified white student in my 14 years of teaching in Compton. And I teach secondary. So I generally, when I was in junior high, I had about 170 students a year. So that's a lot of students. But now with continuation, we have less because, you know, they need more one-on-one. So I have like half the students, which is nice. But yeah, so I'm definitely a minority when I walk on my campus. And I do have to say, with the staff, like the teaching staff, as well as, classified, same. Predominantly, we have lots of, I work with amazing Black women, and Black men, and we have a huge Filipino group of teachers. We have Latinx teachers. There's, white teachers. So the Compton's teaching staff is pretty diverse as well, which is amazing. And so I went from growing up in Huntington Beach, being part of, looking everywhere and seeing me, to going somewhere where I really felt out of place, because it wasn't the culture I was used to. And I really had to go through a lot of self-exploration in that process to become who I am today. And I'm obviously still growing, and still changing and evolving. But yeah, it's definitely been a process, but it's wonderful. I've learned so much, and I've grown so much, I think, as a person. And I'm happy I made the choice to teach in Compton.
What is critical race theory?
It's graduate level theory for law school that basically looks at, with this, their basic premise is that no one race is going to be more criminal than another, right? Or more apt to commit murder, more apt to, so one race is not, race really has nothing to do with one's willingness to do bad things, right? And so if there's a disparity, if there's an issue with the numbers, like if we look at arrests in the United States on the government website, the Black community makes up about 24% of the arrests, but yet they make up 13% of the population. So we look at that, or, they make up 24% of those charged with a crime, right? So if we look at that and we go, okay, so Black people aren't more likely to, commit a crime than white people, then why are they disproportionately being arrested more, right? So if you look at that and go, what's happening here? What's causing this? Now, there's many ways you can attack that, but that's pretty much what critical race theory does and it's a graduate level work. It's all about disparities in law. It has no place in high school, middle school, elementary school, or before that. Now, if there's been this blurring of the lines of critical race theory and teaching history, right?
Right.
And I think that's a huge disservice, because again, critical race theory, there's a purpose for it. It's to look at disparities. See, now I can say the word, in law, and to look at the disparities that are actually affecting people and can affect communities and can be pretty harsh, and going, okay, it's not that police are bad, but why are Black people being arrested more? Is it that there are more police officers on the streets in Black communities than in white communities? So could that be a reason? And it just looks at a lot of other things. And could there be bias amongst people, which, we have to own our own bias, even with teachers. We still are suspending and expelling students of color at a higher rate than white students. And so, we have to look at that and go, do we have a bias? Are we looking at the actions of a Black student compared to a white student and going and viewing the Black students' actions harsher than the white students, right? And that is something that we have to look at ourselves, because that does actual harm, right? So so again, that's not, I don't consider that critical race theory when I talk about education, because again, that theory is a documented theory that is written, it has been written about, but again, it pertains to law school, right? So what I'm talking about is really just looking at the disparities and trying to fix the system, even if it means looking at myself, because
Okay.
that's key,
So,
right?
what I'm hearing is that critical race theory itself, that term is used specifically in the law school setting and looking at the law and how it's used. What I
Right.
hear with that, it reminds me of when I was in seminary, not law school, but seminary, and we would do biblical criticism, not insulting the Bible, not putting it down, but ways of looking at, lenses of looking at scripture. And we would say, so you have um, historical critical theory, which is to try to put things in the context of the time, to understand what was going on then.
Right.
Or literary theory of the Bible, to say, is this poetry? Is this prose? Is this meant to be a fanciful story? And
Right.
that's seminary stuff, but it does translate to the stuff that we
Right.
do every day and with younger kids. When we teach someone, Jesus speaking in parables is making a metaphor that's here. Now, that's still literary criticism of the Bible, to talk about a parable is not meant to be a true story. It is meant to give an example. So sometimes that the great theories, literary criticism or historical criticism, all these
Right.
things can be used. And certainly there are also cultural criticisms looking at the Bible as well. And again,
Right.
not putting things down, but rather saying what was different about that culture than this culture. And it's a way of understanding what it is we're teaching. So that seems to be where it comes into the history. And you're in a unique
Right. And
place.
it's just like in English, we look at historical criticisms and we look at like if you look at Ayn Rand and you look at where she came from and her history, so why she went the crazy opposite way. And you know what I mean? And so you definitely look at the author and what they write and why they decided to write what they did, right? And how their history and their experiences affect what they put in a book, right? So everything we do, we're constantly trying to look at something and not just take it at face value. Yes, we, the person, the reader, bring something to the text, but at the same time, we also have to look at a text for its historical context, right? For its purpose, right?
Then there's something that complicates this. We're not just looking at history. We end up looking at, well, this is where privilege comes in, because we look at how what has happened in the past affects what is going on today. And when we talk about CRT, as popularly used there, is like, well, you're telling white kids that this is their fault that this happened way back when. And in California, the struggle that we're dealing with in particular right now, is hearing about it again this week, is trying to find some way of giving back land that was taken from indigenous persons. When we look at telling the truth about Junipero Serra and about the missions, are we trying to make the descendants of the Europeans, of the Mexicans, of those who had land here, who had land grants by the various governments here, that were taken from other people? Are we trying to make them feel bad when we're talking about the truth of what happened?
Well, and no. I had a student one time when we were just, I can't remember what we were talking about. But he said, wow, he's like, you're the first white person that I've heard that hates white people. And I was like, I don't hate white people. I said, I'm a white person. I don't hate white people. It has nothing, just because I'm very clear in the atrocities that were committed, does not mean that I hate myself or that I hate fellow white people. It doesn't. It means that I have a very clear understanding of the effects of what was done in the past and how that translates into power today, right? Because it's not just in the past. It's not just, oh, the civil rights movement saved everything or changed everything and everything's fine. Well, you know what I mean? You look and you go, oh, wait, that's not the case. So it's hard because it's not so black and white, right? There is nuance, and we have to look at the nuance, right? And you have to talk, and you can't always talk about the negative, because my black students aren't just their maybe enslaved ancestors, right? Because some may have ancestors that weren't enslaved, right? You never know. But that's not all they are. They have a beautiful history before slavery and after slavery, and even during slavery. Even though slavery, I'm not saying it was beautiful, I'm just saying that survival, you know what I mean, and that perseverance, and that the creation of the many things that they did to keep their humanity in an inhumane existence, right? And so that is huge in itself. So not just focusing on that negative, focusing also in the positive as well. And what you reminded me of Columbus, right? And how people were like, oh, Columbus and his guys, that's the way things were at that time. No, there were Catholic priests that were with Columbus and his men that were writing back to the King and Queen of Spain saying, these men are committing horrible atrocities. You need to stop them, but we're not taught that. And so this idea that, oh, that's just the way it was in history. No, doing those horrible things that Columbus and the men after Columbus and the men that Columbus empowered to continue and to do their things, they committed horrible, I mean, it's beyond disgusting. There were parts I just had to put the book down, that are letters from these priests to the King and Queen of Spain. I mean, their words explaining what's happening. I had to put them down because I was disgusted. You know what I mean? And these men are writing in this time saying, this is wrong. You need to stop these people. But they never did because, gold, right? And so we have to be honest. Now, does that mean, Spaniards are horrible people? No. Does that mean, what, Christopher Columbus was Italian, right? So does that mean he's horrible? No. Or that Italians are horrible? No, it's not about that. It's about truly looking, not just, oh, that's just what they did back then. Looking at people as humans and going, well, those they did that too were human. And you as a human, how would you feel right now? Would you just feel, oh, this is the time, so, doing these horrible acts to me is okay? It doesn't make sense to me personally.
I mean, why do we teach history? Why do we teach history? To know about ourselves, yes, but also to know how we came here. But isn't it also to teach us critical thinking skills and being able to look at what's going on now in the light of what our history has been, that we repeat the same arguments?
Well, we are, and I look at oh man, Reconstruction. You look at Reconstruction, and it was a very short time that people were going, you know what, we need to provide resources for this community that we've not allowed to have resources, right? We've not allowed to own anything because we've owned them. So we need to pour money into them. We need to pour resources into them. And then, because of political motivations, we pull out the protections for these people and it all falls apart. And then all of a sudden, and again, I'm not saying this to say I'm hating white people, I'm truly saying this because it's what happened. The white community in the South was like, hey, that's not fair. They're getting resources and you're not helping me. you don't need the help. Like, serious, and I look at it, and my mom is always like, oh, I'm so sorry we couldn't give you money for college. And the whole thing is I told her, I said, when I was younger, yeah, it was frustrating. I felt like that's not fair. My parents didn't have money, but I've come to realize my parents had security and resources, you know what I mean? And my parents, if something happened and I couldn't pay my student loans back, or I was struggling and needed to move back home, I had a place to move, you know what I mean? And I had a room to move into, and so I had that resource to fall back on. Many others do not. And so those grants and things like that for people who are more in need than me, they really need it. I didn't, right? I was going to be okay because I had a family who had resources to fall back on, right?
I never owned slaves. My parents didn't enslave people. My grandparents didn't. My great-great-grandparents did. Maybe way back they did, but that's so long ago. This is all over now. All right. Well, you teach in Compton, and you've
Yeah,
talked about the racial and ethnic makeup of your students, of the people who live there in Compton. That
right.
isn't enslavement in the 1840s and 50s. That was how housing happened in California in the 1940s, 1950s, and 1960s. And even when the law changed, it's not just because the law changed here that everything immediately switches. And when you talk
No,
about generational wealth, that is so. If I were Black, my parents would not have been able to buy the house they bought in Lakewood. And
right.
I grew up in a place that was still called Lily White Lakewood. And
Yeah.
I had aunt and uncle and cousins who lived in Linwood. And I watched the white flight that happened from
Mm,
there.
yeah.
It's still around us. Now, again, is that saying I should feel bad about? Well, yes, I do feel bad about that happened. Should I blame myself? No, but I can
Right.
acknowledge that I have had a benefit that other people might not have
Right.
had. And then from a social policy standpoint, what do we do about that? So you are in a place, you are teaching in a place that it's not just a matter of teaching ancient history, it is looking around the room and acknowledging that there is something unique and a blessing about the
Right.
place where you are. And how did that come to be? It's not like we're dredging up past anger and hatred. It's simply looking, it's not even looking at history, it's looking at today. And it's obvious each day what's happening,
Right.
and going on there. So the question then becomes, what is the right way to address this historic injustice and the
Right.
fact that there hasn't been access?
I do want to say one thing when you were talking about your ancestors owning slaves. I know mine did because I'm a distant relative of Robert E. Lee, right? And so I have that, um, Arlington Cemetery used to be his home, right? And so I have that history. And I was taught for so long that false history that Robert E. Lee didn't want to fight for the South and because my mom was taught that because her, and so it's this story that's passed down that no, he was really a good guy, right? He was really a good guy. And there's this wanting to wash it away. And so I look at what Germany did going in to answer your question. And I look at how Germany has really focused on um, their history, because it's not a question of were my ancestors a Nazi? Yeah. You know what I mean? Did they agree with the party line? They may not have. But again, they didn't stand up. And so the idea is not necessarily going, your grandparents were bad people. It's how did this happen, right? It's not good or bad because, you know, even Hitler had a mom who looked at him as a baby, you know, and loved him, right? And so we have to look at, you know, we have to look at these things. And yes, I do believe people are, you know, I do believe that there's evil. I'm not saying there's not, but we can't just sit there and sit there and just focus on the morality issue. We got to look at why. How is it happening? Because if we're constantly stuck on the morals and we're not looking at it rationally, then we sort of get lost, right? We get this idea that, oh my goodness, my ancestors were bad people. Oh, and then you feel bad, right? And again, learning history, you're most likely going to feel bad. Because there's some pretty bad stuff out in the past, right? And even happening now. And so it's not about that. It's just looking at it and going, this is what occurred. How could that happen, right? What allowed it to happen? How did it affect where we are today, right? And how could we maybe try to fix it so that the effects don't keep going, right? So it's more looking at it rationally, not as they're bad or they're good, right? It's looking at it like, this horrible thing happened. How did it happen? What were the steps that it occurred? And how did it get to be what it became, right? And a lot of it ends up with power and money, right? And land. Those are generally the reasons that horrible things occur, right? Is the want of power, the want of land, or the want of finances, right? So it's looking at that and going, you know, how did a whole country allow these things to happen? Because then there's also that false belief that, well, many Germans didn't know it was happening. Yeah, they did. Like these, you know, the Jewish prisoners were being marched through their towns on a almost daily basis out to work. You know what I mean? And so that idea that, oh, they just didn't know, maybe the ones in the big cities, because maybe, you know, they just didn't go near the ghettos for a while and then the ghettos were gone. But a lot of Germans saw these emaciated Jewish, you know, prisoners being marched daily to work and then to come back. And so that's not true. You know what I mean? The people knew. So then why didn't they step up, right? For fear of themselves. And I get that, right? That you know, that want to preserve the self, right? That is huge. And I get that. Like, if I was living in Russia right now, would I be one of those people protesting? Or would I be in my house because I've got a 6 and a 4-year-old and I don't want them to be without their mom? You know what I mean? Like, that is a
Even have
hard,
access to the knowledge of what's truly going on.
right? And many do. The more I'm learning, the more I'm seeing like history repeat itself, and the more I don't want to stay silent, if that makes sense. So it's that uncomfortableness was important because it's allowed me to see those patterns repeating themselves, right?
And there is always going to be a tension between those who want to speak an uncomfortable truth about history, about how we came to be where we are, and those who prefer a whitewashed, I didn't use that word intentionally,
Right.
view of history that makes everything easy and avoids the uncomfortable truths.
Right.
And that's why I
Right.
want to move into the next part of our discussion with this, which is the faith dimension to this.
Right.
Because there is a big part of it. You know, scripture says throughout, including in Exodus chapter 20, where the Ten Commandments are given, God says that I bless those who are in line with me, and I punish the sins of the fathers, even to the third and fourth generations. There's another passage of scripture that talks about when the parents eat sour grapes, the children's teeth are set on edge. That there is these generational passing down of what is wrong. But
Right.
we're good liberal Christians, and we're uncomfortable sometimes with the term sin. We don't like looking at that. We think, oh, and we buy into what a lot of people in the world say about religion, that religion's about making you feel bad about yourself. It's all about you beating
Yeah.
yourself up, and
No.
all of this stuff about sin. Uh, you know, the reality is we do have to talk about it.
And we do. And I really like what you're talking about, visiting the sins on even, the fourth and fifth generations and stuff, because, I am my liberal progressive here. I believe we should pay reparations. And that money is my tax money, right? And so it needs to hit us and if not physically, if not emotionally, in the pocketbook, right? And so if there's never really a seeking of forgiveness, right? And really, what is forgiveness is admitting wrongdoing and doing everything in your power to right that wrong, right? And so, what can we do? Well, we can't go back and free, those who were enslaved for their lives. We can't do that. But what we could do? We could give the resources and the money to their posterity, their future, right? And basically provide that. And that would, in a sense, that would be our reckoning with our past. And so I'm one who believes in that, because money won't just save everything. I'm not saying, that, oh, money would make everything perfect. No, but it needs to happen. You know what I mean? Because we've consistently taken and first not paid for the work, right? And then taken it when they've built it. And there's history of that, right? It's not just one instance, it's not just a few instances, but it's many instances of Black communities that have finally built wealth, and white people come in and just wipe it out. And so that is something, or we just don't let them build that wealth. So I feel like that is something that our generation needs to deal with and needs to provide. And yes, we are 4 or 5 generations later from those who committed the sins, but we've never truly sought, forgiveness.
But when do we get forgiveness? When does it finally let go? Shouldn't it have been let go with 20 acres and a mule?
But those 20 acres and a mule were never given to everyone, and a lot of it was taken back. So the 20 acres and a mule was a myth. Many people who did get them were actually forced to give the 20 acres back to those who had originally enslaved them. So no, that is.
So we do some reparations now. Then what happens when 3 generations later, somebody else comes and says, now you got to do this again?
What do you mean for what?
When are we let off the hook?
Whenever we're never allowed off the hook. So again, it's not, and it won't always, I'm hoping it won't always be the white community that's doing wrong. I'm hoping, you know what I mean? And it's not always, don't get me wrong with that, but we can't even, all I'm going to say is this: we can't even think about years down the line until we do, right? And it's that idea for me, could we pay reparations and it be done correctly, right? Let's say, which is kind of hard to imagine, but let's say, people show their ancestry, are able to do that, and they're provided the reparations, and 10 years down the line, someone says, oh, well, what about this? The thing is we honestly it has to be more than reparations, but for me, that's where it starts. What really has to happen also is a cultural mind shift. And I think that doesn't happen until we stop, like you said, whitewashing our history, right? And so that cultural mind shift of like, we kind of, how we look at people who are different than us. And it takes a psychological change, it takes a cultural change. So yes, I think there is work after reparations, to sort of answer your question. Do I think it'll ever be done? Honestly, I can't answer that question until we start the work, right? Because you have to start the work to ever know that it's going to be done. Just like someone who it has an addiction to drugs or to alcohol. Will you ever live a life without the craving of alcohol? Well, you don't know until you start that work, right? So I think that you can't answer that question until you start it. And you can't start it until you truly seek forgiveness, right? The idea, right, is that admittance and trying to right your wrong, right? And yes, we are generations down the line, but as you say, it's biblical. See, there you go. Reparations is biblical.
Well, there's a lot of words that come into play here with this.
Yeah.
There's a difference between forgiveness and reconciliation, and there's a difference between forgiveness and release.
I see what you're saying.
We understand as Christians that Jesus, and I'm going to use really traditional language here, Jesus died for our sins.
Right.
He died in our place so that we're forgiven from that. We're coming up to Good Friday soon, when we remember that Jesus died on the cross for our sins. And that would have been enough. There's a great tradition of the DNU from Judaism. It would have been enough. It would have been enough if God had stopped there and just forgiven us for our sins. But God goes ahead and brings resurrection, brings new life, brings reconciliation, brings a possibility of a better future that is there. That comes into play here. But start specifically with this, is that the fact that there is this blanket forgiveness by God, it's not changing who God is. God is letting go, but that doesn't mean that it's realized in our life, that we don't have release from our shame, from our guilt, from the results, simply because forgiveness has been announced. It's until we grapple with it, until we wrestle with it, not beating ourselves up, but acknowledging the hurt that has been done and the hurt that's been done to us in this, the shame that is there. But the fact that we are forgiven for sin through Christ, it doesn't mean that that's actuating us. It doesn't release us. It doesn't free us from our shame, from our guilt, until we acknowledge the truth. And then it is not simply enough to have this freedom. We seek reconciliation. And not only reconciliation, but justice. And there's a different word than forgiveness.
Right.
I think it's such an important word to use here, that it is not simply, the reparations aren't about if we pay this, they'll forgive us.
Right.
It is we are making this payment from, actually practically using more wealthy people's money than our own, from where taxes come from. But we are using this payment as a way to bring things into balance. That's what justice is in a religious sense there. It is saying things are still askew, and it's clear to us that things are still askew. So
Yes,
bringing something that helps bring balance into there after
right,
all of these years is not getting paid off for the wrong
right.
we have done. We don't have to feel ashamed about it. We don't
And
have to
it's,
feel guilty about it.
and
That's
we can't just stop there though. We have to also, because there's generational trauma, right? And so it's not just providing reparations. There has to be social services provided with things, right? And resources put into communities that have been predominantly redlined, right? And so you have to like, so what I would love to see in my schools is I would love to see one social emotional counselor for every 400 students. That way they can pull them out and do small group, therapy sessions at least once every 2 to 3 weeks, right? And really working with these kids on their social emotional skills instead of going, oh, teachers, here's 15 minutes a day, you get to teach it in classes that are, bigger than should be if we're really talking about these things, right? And so, because my students have trauma, right? Many of us now have trauma because of COVID. Like, so there are these things that need to be put in place, but that takes money and that takes resources. And what people don't realize is that if we spend the money now to do those things, we won't have to spend that much later, right? And more revenue will come in, right? When we do provide those resources, because then, if we help, then we get productive tax-paying citizens in the end, right? Very few people want to live off of welfare for the rest of their lives, right? And if they are, there's some other reasons. It's not because they don't want to work, right? That idea that people don't want to work. We all realize that that's BS now after, being stuck in our houses for how long, right? We all realize that many of us want to leave our homes to go work because it provides that purpose. And so this idea that like, yes, money, reparations is where we start. So for me, it's we cannot really talk about forgiveness and reconciliation or any of that stuff until we're honest about, let's at least pay back the stolen wages, right? And the stolen resources that we've taken. And then at that point, then we can start having the conversation, because it's not until we're willing to actually, provide something for me, that I think it's real, right? Because we can give lip service. We can all take a knee. We can all, do these certain things. We can all not stand during the national anthem. That's huge, right? That's a huge act, and it costs many people their careers and their livelihood. So I'm not trying to minimize
for
it,
people of color.
but at the same time, there has to be more than slogans or gimmicks. There has to be true resources, true, some substance behind it, right?
But isn't
So
it
yeah,
also small things too? I'm going back to the classroom here.
right.
And and why is it that I want to teach my kids that it's important to make sure that other people get to go first sometimes?
When we were reaching Achebe's one of his books, and he writes about how Africans were kidnapping Africans for the slave trade, right? And that could make my African American students feel uncomfortable, but it's what happened. Why were they doing it? So that them or their family weren't kidnapped and sold away to white people, right? So what was really that cause, you know? But it's what happened. Yeah, and so it's not looking at it and going, well, see, you guys are just as bad as we are. You know what I mean? But it's going, okay, so this happened because of this, right? They wouldn't have been kidnapping their brethren if white people weren't coming to the shores. to buy them, right? And so we have to really look at that. And it's not just looking at the negative, but it's just giving a picture. It's like, okay, so this is the good, the bad, the ugly, right? And having that wide view, because again, if you're constantly, I think there is a problem with constantly being on that negative, right? Because it's not, like I said, history isn't black and white. And even, even the great emancipator Abraham Lincoln thought that, slavery was ordained by God, right? And so you look at you look at things and you have to go, people are not perfect. And how do I know that? Because I'm a person, I'm not perfect, right? And so, and when we can be honest with our imperfections of ourselves, it's easier to sort of distance that uncomfortableness. It's the weirdest thing. The more honest I am with who I am, I'm not as like, oh, I'm a sinner, I'm a bad person. But the more honest I am with who I am, being imperfect and not always making the best choices, not always making the wisest decisions, not always being who I should have been or who I should be, allows me to really look at people in history with that with humanity, and going, they were human, making horrible decisions. I can see how people do that, right? Because I am human and I've made horrible decisions in my past. You know what I mean? Like, I'm not perfect. And so that allows that sort of, oh, I don't feel as much shame being honest about my history, because I was able to be honest about me. And then I can be honest about my history. And then I can be honest about my ancestors and go, I get it, man. People are just mean to people. Humans are inhuman to other humans throughout history, right? And that's not going to stop until we're honest about it, right? Because we can't sit here and go, oh, I'm perfect and these people are bad, right? Then we're going to start vilifying them, and then being mean and inhumane to them becomes easier, right? And that's how it always happens. So it's not until we go, you're human, and I don't like the RNC, right? But I understand Republicans are human, right? I may not like their organization, and I may go, what are some of the people doing? You know what I mean? But I understand they're human. I understand there's a humanity to them, right? And so do I want horrible things to happen to fellow humans? No. You know what I'm saying? Like, I hope that makes sense. I know I sort of went in a circle, but it's that idea that once you admit your own humanity, I think, and people need to start admitting that they're not perfect, because a lot of people look at themselves as, I'm perfect, right? And I think that's when it becomes easier to be inhumane to others.
Don't tell your mom, but what you just said there, even up to it, including RNC in some other form, sounded very much like the Apostle Paul writing in the letter to the Romans. Although Paul said that he was perfect according to the law, but he recognizes his own imperfections in his history and what he had done. So I think that's great, and he is the one who talks about grace and teaches us about that. So I'm gonna close this out here. And invite some discussion for those of you who are watching this, whether that discussion happens in your own mind or with other people. I want you to think about these terms. How does it make you feel when you learn an uncomfortable truth about yourself, whether that's your past history or whether you grapple with your own personal realized sin? And then what do you do with that? What do you do in terms of people that you have wronged? What do you do in terms of this generational history, somebody you haven't wronged, but how do you deal with your own privilege that comes out of that history? What is the right thing to do? And then think through these words that have application, both in the secular realm and in the realm of spirituality and religion. And those words about forgiveness, reparation, reconciliation,
Right.
freedom from captivity, and justice. These are all important concepts to be dealing with, particularly as we move towards the Holy Week and what Jesus did on our behalf that isn't made real, isn't realized until we bring it into ourselves. And we can't have the resurrection into new life until we grapple with these for ourselves. So think about those. I wish you well. I wish you a comfort and strength in the struggle, but I wish that you would struggle. We've got to wrestle with this truth. We've got to acknowledge it, not that we would feel bad about ourselves, but that we might experience freedom, that we might be able to live in true community, and that we might be able to experience again, from a religious perspective, the power of the Holy Spirit guiding us into new ways of being, and that the realm of God might be evident in earth. That this is what those who continue to seek justice are working toward, not their own self-aggrandizement, not putting anybody else down, but working.
Can I say something?
Righteousness. So
Can I say something?
Please.
Yeah, just how we look at those less fortunate, right? Seeing homeless. And I've noticed a huge shift, which is looking at people who are homeless going, wow, I wish we had the resources to truly provide the wraparound services, which we do actually, we just don't put them there, to actually provide the services to treat people that we generally view as less than, as humans, because they're humans, and they deserve to be treated with humanity. Even the addicts talking to themselves, walking down the streets, they deserve it. And we should, because if we were a world that was truly living the way God wanted us to be, we would be treating the others, right, with that love and that kindness, and providing them what they needed, right? So that's powerful. Just thinking of a world that God imagines. That would be wonderful, huh?
All right. Well, thank you all. Bless you. And thank you for that word, Kristen. We'll talk with you all next month with Upside Down.